So welcome everyone to this week's edition of Military Trailblazer Office Hours. Thanks so much for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to spend it here in the spirit of community mentorship and learning. I'm your host, Dave Nava. I'm a lead solution engineer at Salesforce and a military trailblazer. Each week we invite a co-host or sometimes co-host to take part in the conversation so we can leverage their experience, their expertise, and their unique perspectives. Tonight's session will explore a military trailblazer's transition journey from the Army and examine their lessons learned during a 35-year career in technology. So if you're contemplating a career change to tech, or you're already in tech and are looking for best practices to guide you on your path, this is the session for you. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here in just 1 second, so we can introduce our co-host. I'd like to welcome and briefly introduce our co-host for tonight's session, Brion Schweers. Brion is a Senior Vice President of Revenue Cloud Solutions at Salesforce. His professional career began as an aircraft powertrain repair mechanic in the U.S. Army. And after serving for 6 years, Brion transitioned to tech sales and marketing, where he spent the next 35 years improving product-to-cash processes for enterprises around the world. As such, Brion has deep experience leveraging teams and technology to improve sales productivity. It is awesome to have you here tonight, Brion. Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here, David.
Yeah, appreciate you making time. If you want to take a moment and further introduce yourself and share your Salesforce story, that would be great.
Sure. So, it's great to be here with you and with everybody joining the call today. I'm excited to share the story and the lessons I've learned. I joined the Army in 1980. So it's been 42 years since I started sort of my professional career, including the time in service. And I have to say, to sort of level set, I was going to community college and didn't like it, and I dropped out and I joined the Army to become a helicopter mechanic. And so, I go from not only Army helicopter mechanic, but college dropout to, and of course, as we'll discuss later, I finished my degree. But after a rough start, today I'm as David says, a SVP at Salesforce, responsible for our Rev Cloud solutions. In the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of mentoring, and through that, I've sort of done some self-reflection. And so some of the key concepts that I've discovered along the way, I've shared with others and sort of solidified this. And I think that's a lot of what we'll chat about today.
Yeah, that's awesome, Brion. It's typically when we interview folks who have transitioned, it was transitioning a couple of years ago. So it's really a unique experience and an awesome opportunity to get the perspective of someone who's been in the industry for a long time, so we can kind of take a look back throughout your career. Yep. And for those just joining, apologies, my camera is off. I'm having some bandwidth troubles. My area is just not great for bandwidth, which I get told during demos all the time, but that's another story. So we will continue here. And so if you are joining for the first time, something that I like to do is I always like to briefly explain the purpose of these office hours before we open the floor for questions and discussion. And I know we have some first-time attendees here, so welcome. It's awesome to have you here. These sessions are an informal get-together for gathering with both military trailblazers and allies. Everyone is invited and welcome to explore non-technical Salesforce career and branding-related topics in order to help you achieve your professional development and career-related goals. So for this next hour, this is your opportunity for collaborative mentorship. Everyone on the call is encouraged to step up and both help ask and answer questions from your perspective, which provides additional diversity of experience to the answers given and a richer dialogue. It's not one person answering, it's the collective group, which is awesome. Please do keep an eye on the chat window tonight during tonight's session. As you've already seen, I and others will be sharing information, LinkedIn profiles. If you'd like to do that, please post your LinkedIn profile so you can connect, because we always have to be branding. And I'll be sharing little snippets that I've clipped from LinkedIn posts throughout the week, things from Trailhead, things of that nature. If you want to ask a question at any point during today's session, please feel free to do so. This is your session. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up, that's okay. You can post your questions in chat, and I will do my best to monitor hands raised and the questions in chat and call on you in the order received. Finally, tonight's session is being recorded. If you'd like to share an attribution-free comment, something you don't want the rest of the world knowing, please let me know before speaking, and I will speak with my editor and make sure that it's edited out of the final recording. So with that, we will go ahead and kick it off and dig in here. So, Brian, one of the toughest aspects of transitioning to a new industry, I have found personally, and that I've, when talking with others, has come up often, is skills translation. So, what I'd like to start with is, what tools, resources, and tips did you rely upon to explain to employers how your mechanical skills as a helicopter mechanic and your experiences translated to the qualifications required for the jobs that you were applying for in the tech industry?
Yeah, so I will say, in eventually, it took me about 3 years and change to be promoted to Sergeant E5. And when I was promoted, I became the production control NCOIC for an aircraft repair shop in Germany. And it was during this time that I completed my degree, actually from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in aircraft maintenance management. And so in my military career, I was using my skills as a helicopter mechanic. Actually, I got college credits for my time in service towards this program. And now I was doing sort of running the shop through, the production control side. And so it was really these two credentials that allowed me to land a job in a certified repair station when I got out as a production planner. But it was in that role, David, where I discovered that my mechanical ability applied beyond being a mechanic and into sort of identifying business processes that could be improved. And then I was introduced to technology and realized that technology allowed me to enable me to transform these business processes in ways that previously were really impossible. So as a result of this, without having ever taken a computer science course in college, I was now promoted to IT manager, and that really changed my career direction forever.
Struggling to come off mute here. That's interesting. That's because a lot of folks don't get the opportunity to kind of test drive their career while they're still in the service. They often have to leave and then try to figure it out. Yeah. So it's
clearly that's not the career I wound up with, but that was my first job, was transition into a role that looked and felt a lot like what I did in the military as I began to explore this other path.
And how did that first role turn out for you? Because I know that one of the common, I don't know if it's a complaint, one of the common occurrences is that when folks get out of the military, that first career oftentimes is not the one they stay with. They bounce around a bit until they find something that fits. How did that first career kind of shape your follow-on journey? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the key is that I leveraged sort of the skills I had to get that job. We all need a job. You get out of the military, you need a job. Frankly, based on my experience and my degree, I thought I'd stay in aerospace and defense forever. But circumstances changed. And what I started to do was this self-assessment that allowed me to evolve into roles that really fit my calling, so to speak. And those of you guys that have talked to me before, I refer to these as superpowers. And I truly believe that every human being is born with certain innate abilities. And by discovering those, we start to map what it is we actually do to what role we could play within a business. And the mechanical ability, is certainly one of them. But I think of integrity and this natural curiosity as my other sort of superpower. So I find myself having to be in a place where I need to live in sort of a state of truth, and that my mechanical abilities and my natural curiosity allow me to sort of delve into things and think about it like this: is there's the job description and then there's the what you actually do. And I think we'll find that even in the military, you and the person to the left and right of you may have had the exact same MOS, but how you approached that job was different. And when we sort of self-assess and think about what makes me tick rather than what was the job I had, then we start to be able to map that to what are the things that are interesting to me moving forward. And so you know, and David, I know you're more recent transition, and you certainly are now wearing that golden hoodie. So I wonder if you, and I don't mean to put you in the spot in front of everybody, but I wonder if you think about what superpowers brought you from the military into Salesforce to, in fact, to this forum right here in the golden hoodie. What would you think are sort of your superpowers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that, and then I want to circle back and anchor on something you said about self-assessment, because that is huge, and I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle with all the things that we're going to talk about tonight. That was the key to unlocking where I am today. But my superpowers, I've always felt, have kind of been just work ethic and love of process and planning. And when I think of superpowers, I think of meta skills. I don't necessarily think like, oh, I'm really good at this very specific skill, like Microsoft Word or,
Right.
building code. I think of higher order skills that allow me to learn other skills and apply a broader range of skills. So because I'm able to, devote a lot of my free time to pursuing a path, my work ethic, and I get up early and I set a schedule and I'm able to meet that schedule. That's helped me throughout my career path. And then that attention to detail and that love of process it worked back into the whole transition process. Because when we're looking, whether you're military or you're not military, doesn't matter. If you're transitioning, you have to have a strategy. And the more process centric you are, in my opinion, the better you're able to create that strategy and follow it. And so that was my other superpower. In addition to work ethic, it was process centricity. And part of that process, and this is where I circle back to something you mentioned, was that self-assessment. So, when we talk about how do you make that first step, there's the unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
And leaving the military like I did after 20 years, where I'm fourth generation Navy, I'd never done anything else or experienced anything else. All I knew was, being a naval flight officer and leading sailors. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was faced with tons of unknown unknowns. And the way that I battled through that was that self-assessment that you brought up. And so let me flip the question back to you, and then I'll provide my answer as well, because I think this is worthwhile to dig into. How did you do that self-assessment? What was your process for that? And what, obviously it yielded, a rich career path, and you're in the place that you were meant to be. And I believe I am too, but I want others to be able to unlock that self-assessment and wind up there as well with their specific career path without having to go through the circuitous path that most folks do, where they bounce around until they finally figure it out.
Yeah, no, I think this is critical. It is, we call it emotional intelligence. And it's interesting that sometimes I ask people, and the answer is I don't have time to do that. And it's like, but this is the most important thing, sort of brother, know yourself. And the way I think about it is that there's things we've done in life, whether it's school or sports or a job, where we just naturally fit. And there were other things where we were unnatural fit, sort of like going with the grain versus against the grain. And if you look back at your even high school, if you played sports or debate team or whatever it was, there's reasons why you gravitated to that thing. And when you start to identify those superpowers, I said I'm a mechanic. If I look back at my life when I was a small kid, I would disassemble the phone. My mom would come home from work and the phone would be all over the floor in pieces, not broken, disassembled. And what are you doing? I just needed to know how it worked. And I don't know why I had, that natural curiosity or that need to, turn wrenches, but I did. I built go-karts, whatever it was. And it's those things that carried through why I was successful in the Army and why I was able to do well in the courses I took at Embry-Riddle, having barely, maintained a C average at community college. And you start to realize there's interests, there's things that I'm interested in, and therefore I'm going to lean into them and do well. And there's things that I'm not interested, and therefore it's not to say I can't do it, I just don't enjoy doing it. So if we start to identify those, then we can look at our life and say, when I was in the military, what's the thing that got me through basic training, or through, if you were in combat, that very difficult high stress situation, right? And then what made you stand out in whatever role it was? And I think what most people will find is, even though your career appears to be bouncing around, it's the same sort of rocks that you gravitate towards, and you find yourself in job A where you like these things and you didn't like these things, and you went to this other job that might look on your resume completely different, but it was the exact same sort of superpowers, as I call them, that allowed you to succeed there, and the sort of the anti-superpower that created the friction that made you unhappy there. And so I call putting all that together the string of pearls, and we start to create a trajectory, so to speak, right? And so when we start to see how these things affected everything and how it advanced in our career, or we stepped into a promotion or whatever, or why we didn't like a place we were at, we can start to set this trajectory. And then this starts to be our personal brand. It starts to be just our truth. And ultimately, what I believe is we get from what was seemingly sort of shotgun blast, spray and pray, okay, I need a job. How about this? Okay, so you needed a job and you got the job. What'd you like? What'd you do well? How does that affect what you're going to do next? And it gets you to this trajectory, or more like a rifle shot, where we're going to take aim on what we want to do, because now we know what makes us happy. We're going to spend a ton of time working, so we want to do something that aligns with sort of ourself. And I'll stop. I know I'm rambling, David, but
no, this is great stuff. So you mentioned something. You said, a lot of folks say, well, I don't have time to do that. And I was one of those people that said that, but I would counter, now knowing what I know, you can't afford not to spend that time. Because what's the quicker path? Bouncing around different careers for a couple of years while you try to figure out, or spending 2 months and really doing a deep dive on yourself to figure out what your affinities are, what your skills are, where your interests lie, what your passions are, what kind of culture that you get along with, all those things that go into working for a company. And we don't always know what our interests are until we look. Yeah. And so for me, I've done one thing. If you'd asked me, hey, David, do you see yourself in a creative job where you're creating things? I'd be like, no, I'm not creative at all. Like, I can follow a checklist, I like digging into stuff, but I am not creative. And, fast forward a few years and I'm in a position where I'm creative every day, and I take great pride and joy and passion in it to the point where it doesn't seem like work. And so I want to provide a practical tool, because for folks that are like, well, okay, great, do a self-assessment. How do I do that? I'm going to paste a link in chat here. Some of you have heard of this book because I bring it up. Some of you haven't. What color is your parachute? Oops. And that wouldn't be it. That'd be the same thing I just pasted. 1 second. Let's see. Here it is. There it is. Yeah. So that last link is what color is your parachute. It comes out every year. I think 2022 is the latest edition. You might look for 23. But that is a book that walks you through how to do a deep dive on yourself, a bunch of practical exercises. And you look at it, you're like, God, I don't have time to do this. But you really do. And it will truly unlock, especially if you don't know what you want to do, it'll unlock your future career path for you. The other thing, the other book that I would recommend is called Designing Your Life. And I'm looking for the link right now. And I would say read What Color is Your Parachute first. It's a great book. And I've still got it. And then read Designing Your Life, because Brian, you touched on something else, and I'm going to paste the link in there, that was huge. It was, you got exposed to IT during your term of service, and that ultimately influenced your future career path. And while you didn't necessarily end up in that specific role, that was a critical part of your journey. And Designing Your Life, what it does is it uses design-based principles to teach you how to test drive career paths. So rather than going and working in a career for a year, and if it's not a good fit, gosh, that's wasted time perhaps. you can test drive something very quickly, informational interviews, volunteering, doing the work on your own, and get a feel for if it's a good fit or not. And I did that, and ultimately it steered me away from what I originally thought was a great career path toward where I was supposed to be, and I saved that time.
No, and that's awesome. I mean, and that's for me, I didn't. I bounced like many others, and I look back and I see the connection between them. But if you go look at me on LinkedIn, how do you go from helicopter mechanic to this to that? Right? But there's clearly this line in there that is the sort of the who I am and what makes me tick. Because you're going to gravitate to the things you want to do, and you're going to do more of those things, and someone's going to notice, just like me. And next thing you know, I'm in IT. But when you do that, also start to think about, what does my resume need to look like? Because when I get resumes, even in my role, we're hiring people from time to time, and I get, I'll put an ad on LinkedIn or whatever on a Friday. They come back Monday, and let's say there's 100 resumes in there. I open up those resumes, and most of them, I can't figure out who this person is or why they applied for this job. And it's just facts. I had this job, and I did this, and I did this. It's job description after job description. And so what I tell folks is, once you've identified those superpowers and that string of pearls, start to construct your resume in a way that tells your story, that says, I had this job and I achieved this outcome. And that got me to this next job where I leveraged that thing I did and achieved another outcome. And if you think about it in terms of like land navigation, if you've got to get from, one waypoint to another across a mountain in the dark full of trees, right? You kind of know where you're going to go. You set a path. You got to check yourself along the way. And sometimes along that path, you're going to hit an obstacle. You got to go left or the right or up or down. And when you do those, you're making course corrections. Ultimately, ideally, you get to your final destination. But the point is there's a journey there. And we start to understand that and track that, then we can tell a story about how we got from here to there. And even if you're bouncing around, it told you something about yourself. If you think about an inventor, how many times did Thomas Edison have to fail before he got the light bulb to work, right? And so all those jobs are learnings for you. And if you can fast track that with the information that David shared, then you can save sort of years of experimentation and sort of get there a little bit quicker than I did. But the other thing I would say is, we all think about what do you want to do? And I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a policeman. But what do you really want to do comes back to this sort of, who am I? My wife is an artist. She wants to draw. No, she has to draw. So when you get to these superpowers, you really start to find out what you have to do. And now you're aligning potential careers around these skills that you were born with, rather than trying to force fit yourself into something that looks good, pays a lot of money, whatever, but isn't really going to give you the satisfaction you need in it.
Yeah, those are great points. And that was one of the things that I struggled with most, was writing a resume. I started 5 years in advance because I knew I'd be awful at it, and I wasn't disappointed. And went through, dozens and dozens and dozens of revisions until finally I just realized I couldn't get there on my own. And so I wanted to offer just a couple practical tips. And this doesn't necessarily only apply to folks that are writing their resume for the first time, breaking into a career. It's writing a resume for any position. You may have been in the same position for a decade, and you're going to a slightly different one. Still, I think, good guidance. But what helped me a lot was I did informational interviews, and many of you know what those are. You leverage a LinkedIn connection or a Veterati connection, 15 to 20 minutes, talk about their job so you can get a feel, develop your network. But really, it helps you speak the language, and it clues you into what terms are used, what the current challenges are, what the trends are, and how to frame your experience in a way that makes sense in that given industry. And you won't know that until you talk to people and get their perspective. It also opens a door to that person to say, hey, thanks for the 15-minute call. Would you mind taking a look at my resume and pointing out one thing that you would change, right? And no one's going to tell you no if you're just asking for 5 minutes of their time and one thing. Yeah, here's one thing. And if you have enough of those conversations, pretty soon you've got a decent resume. Start early. Obviously, informational interviews and forming the relationships that are required to make those happen takes time. So you can't rush that. And then ultimately what I did was I paid someone to write my resume. I was awful at it. I had gone through a couple of free services, which were helpful, gotten me part of the way. But then I paid a professional resume writer a few $100, and they produced something that I would never have because they do that for a living, and it's not something that I do for a living. And that's what kind of got me over the finish line and got me interest from recruiters. That was one of the things, was that resume that really, to your point, Brian, told my story.
Awesome. Awesome. And I would say, David, then the next thing is your interview. You need a resume that gets you in the door. But now that you're in the door, you need to be able to nail the interview. And to do that, as Henry Kissinger famously quipped years ago, is what questions do you have for my answers? And I say this to folks because I think it's important for you to not worry about what they're going to ask you, but think about what you want to tell them, right? So if you come up with 5 things that you want the interviewer to know about you, then you go into that interview knowing I need to share this about me to you, but don't just walk in the door and say, hey, by the way, I got 5 things I didn't tell you. Well, go to the interview, let them ask a question, and figure out which one of those 5 things is the right answer for the question they asked, and do it back in story, tie it back to your resume, but give them something personal about you, right? Because we say in sales, people buy from people, people hire people, and creating that human connection matters. So being comfortable in your skin, knowing who you are and what you want to be, what you want to get out of the job is just as important. Think about going to the interview to interview the interviewer, right? Is this the company you want to work for? Is just as important as are you the right person for the job, right? And I'm going to pause because I know Iris has her hand up and probably a couple others at this point. Oh, and you're on mute, Iris.
Yeah, go ahead, Iris. And then we'll get to Amber's question, and then I've got a resource to offer as well.
Yep.
Oh, thank you so much for being here, Brian. I love your story and how you found your way. I find that hindsight's such a wonderful thing. Like, it's very easy to say this is what you should do, but as we all know, when we're transitioning, whether you're a spouse, a transitioning officer, there's a lot of anxiety, and coming into the Salesforce ecosystem where everything's so foreign, it's really hard to do some of the steps that we are discussing right now. Do you have any tips or advice on how to possibly get over that kind of anxiety to be able to do that necessary work instead of just, you know, blasting through, not getting where you need to, you know, and ended up in a job that you may not want, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things. And number one is identify that it is important to do this. One of the books, and I don't know if you got a link to it or not, David, but one of the ones I recommend people is Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And the reason I really like this book is it's a personal manual. And the book basically says, IQ you're born with, EQ you can develop. Let me show you how. And so in the EQ book, you're basically going to take a self-assessment in the book, and it's going to say, here's where your strengths and weaknesses are, and allow you then to, and give you sort of guidance on how to overcome it. And so then you build your network, and let's say that, for example, you're not comfortable with public speaking. So and that's what, let's say the book showed you that. Maybe you already knew that, but the book reinforced that this is probably where you ought to start. Now, how can I do that? And I think David sort of pointed earlier that there's ways to practice that skill. Maybe it's through a guild, maybe it's through Toastmasters, right? But depending on what it is you want to work on, there's always ways to find a place to work on that skill set. It may just be with your friends and family. It may, you know what, let me go bowling and meet strangers and right. But you can always find something that allows you to work on and develop those skill sets. You got to put the work into it, and hopefully not take 20 years to figure it out.
I find setting small bite-sized goals helps as well, and you complete those goals, they build towards larger goals, and they're not as intimidating as like get a job. Well, no, don't get a job. You know, create an account for Trailhead, for instance, if you're interested in Salesforce. You know, complete 10 badges. Look at the certification guide for admin. Talk to somebody. These sets of small goals that build on each other.
Yeah.
I want to offer one resource, then we'll go to Amber's question, and we'll circle back to Elliot, who had his hand raised. So to Brian's earlier point on interviewing is very much a skill, and you can get bad at it if you don't do it. So it's something you have to keep doing. I thought I'd be great at interviewing because it's just talking about yourself, and I was shocked to find that I was awful at it. So I'm going to paste in here. This is for military veterans and spouses. It's a resource. They provide free mock interviews. Many of you have heard of it. It's Canderful. And Natalie, I see your question as well. We'll get to that in order. But this provides you with coaching professionals that will help you interview, conduct a fake interview, essentially, provide you with guidance, feedback. It's a series of 3 interviews. It's immensely helpful. And if you're not, military veteran, you're not a spouse, you don't have access to it, it doesn't matter. You can still do mock interviews. You can have your friends interview, have your significant other interview you. Basically, what you need to do is get comfortable telling your story, to Brian's earlier point, and have those 5 or 6 stories, again, to his earlier point, you have in your hip pocket that you can apply when you get asked that question. What was the biggest challenge you faced? When did you deal with conflict? All those common interview questions. If you got a story for each one and you roll it off and you're able to, put some vibrance into it, and it's easy and it flows, that's half the work right there. But you have to get comfortable with those stories. You got to memorize them. You got to, you got to practice at it. So
and the STAR method I just saw come up. Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. And if you don't know what the STAR method is for interviews and resumes, Google it. And it's a great way to organize your thoughts. So we'll get to Amber's question, then Natalie, Amber's question, then Elio, and then back to Natalie. Amber asks, do you have any suggestions on how we can speak to our other friends who are former mechanics, HR, infantry, mil spouse, and help them see how they fit into Salesforce?
Well, I mean, I do it through Veterati, which is a great resource in any networking group. But, I start with some sort of open-ended questions. What is it about being a mechanic? And for me, being a mechanic is not the turning the wrenches, it's the problem solving. Why didn't my car start? And it's either fire, air, or fuel, right? Either I'm getting a spark or I'm not. I'm getting fire, right? Or right. So do I have a blockage? Do I have a dead battery? Am I out of gas? Right? Are my spark plugs, if they still exist, clogged? And then I work down that decision tree. If I ask somebody else why they're a mechanic, they may say something completely different. And that's the key. It's not necessarily that I was a helicopter mechanic, but it's that I was a helicopter mechanic because I like problem solving. And, and so you get down to these basics like that. And so I would start there with open-ended questions. What is it about this job that you like? Oh, and then you got out of the Army and you worked at a restaurant. What is it about the job at the restaurant that you liked? What's the correlation between the skills you had in the military as a helicopter mechanic and being a cook? And you say, well, cooking was boring, but I spent my time when there was no orders rearranging the kitchen, right? So now we start to find out it's not always the job you were assigned, it's the thing you did while you were in a job you were assigned that really is who you are. And you start to see that connection, right? And ultimately, what I want you to do is get to an interview where, for example, if you go through Salesforce military and the SI is interviewing you to be in a fellowship, you can say, you know what, I actually have been a Salesforce consultant for 20 years. I just didn't know it. Right?
Yeah, it's being a mentor to verbally help them with that skills translation to bridge that gap. Because if they're not doing it on themselves and they don't see themselves in Salesforce, you, who is someone who's been in the ecosystem, can help them bridge that gap with your knowledge. To put a fine point on it. Elio, question or comment from you?
Yeah, I just had a quick comment to add to what Brian said with regards to finding your passion and understanding how to articulate and know what you want to do. I like him, I've been, tech sector for 25 years, and it took me probably a decade to figure that one out. I came into tech where it was a hot market, jobs were plentiful, and I just jumped from job to job every 2 years because you didn't really have to work at it. And then to get to the next level, you really have to understand what's your passion, what do you want to do, and how you can articulate that when asked. And that along with mock interviews, just going back to one of the veterans that I helped get a job at Salesforce, we worked for almost a year before they landed a role. And you could see the person grow from, I need to get a job at Salesforce, to here's who I am, here's what I bring to the table, here's my skill set, here's how I work. And if there's an alignment, great. If not, it's okay, Salesforce, this is who I am. And that's where I think what we're trying to say here from Brian is you got to find, number one, what drives you, number two, how to articulate that, and three, every job interview doesn't have to mean that you have to accept the job. It's a whole process. And the interview process and talking about yourself, you really want to hone that, just like anything else, just like salary negotiation, just like networking and public speaking, as it was said earlier. All of these are components that I think it's great that we're covering, and I commend Brian for bringing that up, because it's very, very important in how you grow a successful career in tech.
Yeah, thank you, Elio. Great points.
Awesome.
We'll move to a question from Natalie, and then we'll take a quick break to grab a group photo so that we can always be branding. And I will turn my camera back on. Natalie asks, and we're going to circle back to kind of the resume topic. Natalie asks, what are your thoughts on cover letters? There are mixed reviews about whether you really need them, but I feel like it helped me with my last job where I had a 6-month gap. I think it's worth the time to write a good one catered to each position. Would you agree?
Yes and no. I think it's good for you to do it. I think it's important internalizing who I am and what I want to do and where I want to go. Honestly, I'm looking at resumes. I get 100 resumes on Monday morning. I'm flipping through the resumes. Some of them have cover letters. And if I like the resume, I'll read the cover letter. If the resume didn't make sense to me, I don't really care what the cover letter said, right? And by the way, computers don't read resumes. People read resumes. So a lot of coaches will tell you to put all these keywords in there. Keywords make it impossible for me to read what you're trying to say, right? So tell me, job one, 3 bullets. What did I do? What did I accomplish, right? Give me measurable outcomes. I led a team of 10 people. We reduced cost by X%. I improved retention rate by Y. Something, I reduced waste, in the restaurant. It doesn't matter. But if you're process oriented, right, think about what it is you're trying to apply for and what are the metrics that are relevant to that. And I think you can put it together. Sorry, I don't know if I totally answered the question there or not at this point, but hopefully that helps.
Well, it's a good point that a cover letter can help, but your resume has to be solid, first. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not providing value, and it doesn't really make a difference. Right. But I feel like in my opinion, if you've got a gap on your resume that you feel like it needs an explanation, whether that was taking a break to take care of a loved one, raise a child, whatever it happens to be, me personally, I would write a cover letter. I would also have an awesome resume, but I would write a cover letter to explain that gap so there's context, because you don't always have space in a resume to provide context, needed context. Having said that, keep it short, obviously, because to Brion's point, he's looking through hundreds of these things. He doesn't have time to read lengthy explanations. So what we'll do here is we will...
And don't apologize, by the way. Don't ever apologize. Sorry, go ahead, David.
If you'd like... Yeah, no worries. If you'd like to participate in the group photo, go ahead and unmute your video. No worries if you would rather remain off camera. I have those days too. And I'll give you a few seconds and I'll go ahead and grab a quick picture of the group. All right, so everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, excellent. Turn my camera back off so I don't kill my internet. And we'll jump back into the questions. Oop, I think I heard a hand raised. Yep, David Albright, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I had 2 comments, Dave and Brian. Thanks for coming on here and spending your time with us. One thought I wanted to make was a lot about what we kind of talk about a lot here every week is really the networking aspect of it, right? What is more important than a paper resume in a stack of paper resumes is getting someone to hand carry said resume to a hiring manager and like, Brian, hey, this guy reached out to me. I know him. I've talked to him several times. I think he'd be a good candidate for you, right? The networking aspect of this should never be overlooked because, just having someone, even in our organization in Salesforce, a huge organization, if someone pings someone through Slack and says, hey, I've got someone that you might be interested in, that goes a long way past that paper stack. Yeah. So sometimes the resume is a requirement that we all have to have, right? But reaching out and having that network, and as we talk about here often, reaching out and just, hey, I'm interested in a position or interested in what you do. Would you mind spending 30 minutes to talk, right? Yeah. And that is always an interview, right? Anytime you get a chance to talk to somebody who could help with a job, always think of it as an interview.
Yeah. And by the way, when you do meet that person and talk to that person, go on LinkedIn and create a connection. Because when I get back to David's point, when I get resumes and I get that short list of the ones I think are interesting, the next thing I do is I go on LinkedIn and see who they know that I know. So even if it didn't get hand carried to me, having that network, if you're in my industry, as long as you say you have been on your resume, then I probably know people you know, right? And so it's an important cross-check. And the way to build networks also, professional groups, right? When I was production control, I joined the American Production Inventory Control Society. I got certified. So that added sort of another credential to my resume, but it also opened up a whole nother network of people that could help carry my resume to that next job.
It's an interesting topic, and I want to piggyback on that because I've got a couple real use cases that came up actually yesterday and today. To David's earlier point, obviously you don't always have the opportunity to have someone hand walk your resume, but you won't know until you ask. And if you do have that opportunity, it's golden. And so let me give you a couple examples where I've done that for somebody twice this week. I had one gentleman and one woman who were both longtime LinkedIn connections, and they reached out to me. And these are folks that have added value to me and my career without asking for anything over a period of, for the gentleman, a couple of years, for the woman, numerous months. And they reached out and they said, hey, would you be willing, or they said they were looking for, for a role. What guidance do I have? And I said, well, here's some guidance, but also let me give you an employee referral. And in both cases I did. And what that does is, and in both cases they're veterans. So not only do they get an employee referral, they're veterans, so they get the veteran preference. So that's kind of a double bonus. But even if you're not a veteran, if you get that employee referral, it gets you noticed above and beyond all the other hundreds of candidates that are also applying for a role. And so it dramatically increases your chances of getting hired. And if the person who's doing it for you is doing their job, and this is what I do, I will deliver that resume referral. I will write up a nice write-up about them. And then I will reach out to that hiring manager and that recruiter within a day or two to say, hey, just following up with you, I recommended XYZ for a position, feel like they're a great fit. Let me know if you have any questions. And because I've owned that process and I've reached out to them, it makes an added impression on that recruiter and hiring manager that this person is a quality person. And when I do that, it doesn't always mean the person gets hired, but folks have gotten hired from that before. So take advantage of that. And I will caveat it to say, do not reach out to someone for the first time and say, hey, great to connect with you. Can you refer me for a job? Big no-no. You're going to get ignored. When people do that to me, like if they're lucky, I will just ignore the comment. If they're persistent, I'll just block them. Because it's like spitting in someone's food. It's the height of rudeness. Like, just don't do it. You have to add value before you ask for value. And if you're not willing to add that value and you're just asking, it's selfish. So it doesn't necessarily have to be months and months and years in these cases. It can be you're adding value for a few weeks and you have a small ask, and then you move on maybe a little later to a larger ask. And so if you're wondering, how do I add value? It depends on what that person values. So I'm a content creator, and the gentleman knows that. And so he added value by sharing my posts religiously, like for a couple of years. Whenever I post something, he'd repost it, he'd comment, he'd share it. And I noticed. And I was like, whenever that guy asks me for something, I'm going to do it for him because he's helped me out consistently. The other person you've met, I won't name her, but you've met because she was a co-host on the show. And I reached out to her and she did a show. She did an awesome job. And then she reached out to me today and said, hey, can you put me in for a referral? Of course I will. Right? Because you've helped me out. You've added value to the things that I find valuable. And the way, and I'll wrap this up and then we'll move on because I see Xavier has his hand raised, is you're not going to know what that person values unless you take the time to form the relationship first and figure out what they value and then provide that value. And then once you've done that, give a small ask. Hey, maybe it's requesting to share a post, or maybe it's an informational interview. And then if you add more value, you can come back with a larger ask like, hey, great phone call, that we had the other day. Maybe you'd like some more of their posts. And then you come back with, do you have any openings at Salesforce and could I talk to you about them? You're not directly asking them for a referral, but if they like you and you've added value, they're going to suggest it because, they know what you're looking for. And neither one of those people directly said, hey, Dave, can I have an employee referral? But they're like, hey, what do you know about, what do you know about open positions? I'm like, okay. They want to get hired. Let me offer that to you because you've given me lots of value. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Xavier for a question or comment. And then Annie after that. And Xavier, you might be on mute.
Yeah, I was.
No worries.
An ongoing problem for me. This is great content. I wish I would have, this is my first time actually joining the call.
Welcome.
Thank you. I had a question. So I've been within this line of work for about the last 4 years. And in trying to, I took a few months of a break and now I'm trying to get back into it. I've had the luck of having a few interviews, but like, so many other people, they go through various phases or stages, and then you get to the end and it's like, well, sorry, we're going to go a different direction. One, I'm tired of those emails or phone calls. Two, I'm trying to figure out how to gain someone's trust when, let's say you submit for an admin position, never once been an admin, but you're, 2-time ranger, or you have, certain certs. Why those positions aren't being filled by someone who's never, how can I get those positions when never having actually done those positions? That's the problem that I'm assuming that I'm having.
I definitely have an answer, but I want to turn over to Brian first in the group.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I have this conversation, the answer is get that Salesforce admin cert and work through Hiring Our Heroes fellowship program. And you do that 12-week fellowship, and I don't know how many folks are on the call that are in Salesforce military or have been in a cohort, But what I find is, having just done that 12-week fellowship through Hiring Our Heroes, along with having the certification, absolutely improves your chances of getting a full-time job with one of our partners.
Okay.
Yeah, the Hiring Our Heroes Fellowship is a golden ticket if you're a active duty service member, veteran, or spouse. But if you're not, what do you do? Because there's some folks on the call that don't fall into those,
Okay.
you know, that category. So in that case, you know, you can do what I did, and it all goes back to that book I recommended earlier, Designing Your Life, where you're test driving career paths. So like, just to give a real quick use case, because I want to get to Denisha's question and then circle back to Annie's raised hand and then Tony's. At the time when I was transitioning about a year prior, had no experience. I was in your shoes, Xavier. I was like, how do I get that that job that I want without prior experience? What I had was time, and I had my superpowers. To Brion's earlier point, I had my process-centric behavior, and I had my work ethic. And so I test drove that admin career path. You know, I volunteered for a nonprofit. Then I volunteered for another nonprofit, and this is all at the same time while I was working a full-time job for the Navy, and got that experience. And ultimately determined I didn't want to be an admin, which was extremely valuable because I saved myself time, but the skills weren't wasted. I used those admin skills that I had, and I applied them to what I figured out I did want to do, which was be a consultant. So I would say to you, volunteer. If you can't find a volunteer opportunity, you just don't have the time, as in some cases, do what admins do. What do? They do discovery, and they build things. So come up with a problem, spin up a free developer org. And you can just Google developer org Salesforce if you don't know where the link is, and think up some business problems, and then create apps, create process automations to solve those problems. Whatever use case you is interesting to you, and there's tons out there, and build those apps. And that way, that's demonstratable work experience, alternative work experience is what I call it, that you can show to employers, and you can actually break out your org during a interview and say, hey, here's what I built. And I've done that. My interview with Salesforce, I broke out my org. And that's why I got hired. I didn't get hired because I was qualified for the position. They didn't actually hire me for the position I was interviewing for. Mm-hmm. They hired me for a different position because they're like, wow, this guy's really passionate about the platform. We want to bring you in. You're not qualified for this job, but we can find you something.
Okay.
So test drive those careers by doing what they do in your free time. To answer Denisha's question really quickly, what are some examples of adding value without direct connection? I think David Albright mentioned it in chat, and I agree 100%. Find out what they value, and then add that value. I do it through social media. So if I want to connect with a content creator and I can't get their attention, then I will like their posts. I will reshare their posts. I will go on their YouTube channels, like it, reshare it. I'll do whatever I can to promote their content that they'll notice. Because every time I like it, I reshare it, I comment on it, they're going to get notified. And eventually they're either going to say, yes, I'll connect with you, or they won't. And at that point, I'm like, well, do I really want to be connected with you if I've added all this value? You're not willing to reciprocate? Probably not. Moving on to the next person. So I know we got a couple hands raised. There was 2 and 1 went down. Annie, go ahead, and then I'll look and see if I can figure out who had the previous hand raised.
This has been a super episode, so I'm very glad I managed to get on here. But one of the big things I have come across when people have reached out to me is they love to talk about the weather or where they're at or things like that. And I'm happy to talk about that if that's what you want to talk about. If you really want to reach out to me because I'm in Salesforce or I'm with the company that I'm with or want to know what I do and how I got where I got, ask that. It's fine to say, how are you doing the first time? But if you message me 6 times about the weather, I'll talk to you about the weather 6 times. So think through why you're reaching out to these people, right? Pay it back, right? Just like David's done. Somebody mentored him. I mentor as well. Anybody who reaches out, I get back to you. Maybe not as quick as I used to because I'm studying for Security Plus, but I do get back to you. So think out why you're reaching out to these people and use your LinkedIn as that informational interview. It doesn't have to be in person. It doesn't have to be on a video. It can be messaging back and forth. So think that through on what you're going to do. So that's all I had, David.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. That's a great point. And I agree 100%. John passed in chat earlier. Have you heard of the 100 call challenge, referring back to his LinkedIn post, which is essentially a method for conducting informational interviews. So I agree 100%. The more you do, the more informed you'll be. And it's a foundational practice for not only learning about your role, figuring out how to get that job, to Xavier's point, but also networking. Because some of those 100 calls will be your mentors that you will keep for the rest of your professional career. One of the first mentors that I had was I drove to Boston. It's like a 2-hour drive one way. And I met, many of you know, Mark Baseman. Mark at the time was an admin evangelist. Now he works for Trailhead Academy as an instructor. I just happened to run into him, and we started a conversation, and that conversation led to him introducing me to Jillian Bruce, and Jillian got me on the admin podcast, and that, you know, so it snowballed from there. And you never know, again, these unknown unknowns, you never know how that's going to turn out until you have that conversation. So I have a lot of them. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to ask Brion one more question, and then also make time if we had some last minute questions. But my closing question would be, if you could pass along one truth, one principle, or one value that has guided you during the past 35 years of your professional career, what would it be?
Yeah, I think I kind of probably already said this already, but to quote Shakespeare, I'd say, to thine own self be true, right? Be yourself, be true to yourself. Don't engage in self-deception. You really want a career here, not a job. And there's a difference. When you truly understand yourself, and is what we've talked about for the hour, and you set that career path around those core values, then your vocation becomes your avocation. And I think it was Mark Twain that said, then you'll never work another day in your life, right? And so think about, and I can't say it enough. Who are you? What do you want to do? What makes you tick? And the only way to find that out is to experiment. And it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to fail, right? I can't play golf. I want to play golf, but every time I try to play golf, I prove to myself I can't play golf, right? And so that's okay. I'm not a golfer. And the only way I knew that was to go do it. So be willing to experiment, to try things, to stretch beyond your comfort zone. And you may find things that you like, and then do another. I told all my kids in college, take 2 of everything. And if you liked it twice, take another. If you didn't, don't take any more, right? And sooner or later, you're going to find that path that's right for you. So just get out and do it, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I'll give you an extreme use case of how I didn't do that during my transition. And if you've heard my transition story before, you're familiar with it. But I knew when I was getting out, right? So I was going to get out at 20. I had a planned date. So I had 5 years to prepare for when I started. I spent 4 of those 5 years proceeding down the completely wrong path. Because as I've often seen, you're in the military, you're doing something, you're like, when I get out, I'll just do the same thing that I'm doing. And maybe you're going to be a contractor, you're right, for one of the companies that you're currently working with, or maybe I'm just going to roll into being. That's where I was kind of. Naval flight officer, otherwise known as no future outside, jokingly, because we're trained for one thing that doesn't exist in the civilian world. So what am I going to do? I'll just do what I've always done. I'll be a project manager. And that sounded good. So I got my PMP, my master's degree, Lean Six Sigma black belt, spent all this money and time, and then got to, a year prior to retiring, and I was like, crap, I don't want to be a project manager. That's like nothing against it, but that is not where my interests lie. And I discovered that very late. I got lucky. To John's earlier point, I started doing my calls, and I met someone who was like, hey, look at Salesforce. And the rest is history. But if I had just, been true to myself and not looked at what I, should be doing based upon what I had been doing, instead of what do I want to do, what done that self-assessment at the earlier part of the conversation that we were talking about, I could have saved myself thousands of dollars, years of time. Ultimately it turned out okay, but it always, it doesn't always, turn out okay, especially when you waste a lot of time after you get out. Had I Had I not figured it out in time, I would have been a single dad with 2 kids and no paycheck. So I got lucky. Don't be that person. Do the self-assessment. Be true to yourself, and that will steer you toward the jobs that matter and that that you'll ultimately find joy and fulfillment with. So we are out of time. Before we close, I want to thank Brion so much for spending the past hour with us to talk to us about his transition journey, the past 35 years of tech, and sharing the insights and wisdom. So thanks so much, Brion.
Thanks. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, and thank you to all of you for spending your time with us this Wednesday evening. Hope to see you back next week. David Albright will be co-hosting a panel from Coastal Cloud. Very exciting. We're doing a whole consulting series, and it is Coastal Cloud's turn at bat. So you can come explore what their culture is like and chat with. It's going to be 8 folks from Coastal Cloud. So big panel. No pressure, David. You'll be fine. And in the meantime, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Bye.